Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a big approach.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to the new podcast presented by the female film critics of InSession Film. We are speaking, we love movies, we are women in session. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us tonight. I am Kristin Battestella. At Therefore Review is my Twitter handle. Zita Short of the 300 Passions podcast is back with us again tonight. Us, the royal we, I suppose. We are talking about some classics tonight. It's kind of cool and kind of dreary, but I'm staying up late, uniting around the globe with Miss Zita to talk about classic film. We're going to talk about Robert Mitchum because Zita has some feelings about Robert Mitchum. Yes. If I recall, we did our Humphrey Bogart episode to end the year. We talk about classics a lot. Our Women in Session, we're a little undefined, perhaps, maybe for podcast audiences, because we've got 6 ladies that come and go. So I don't mind if we repeat or overlap kind of some topics. I want all the ladies to get their voices heard. So we come and go on some classics. We're going to be talking about some more contemporary ladies and a few awards things in the future. There is actually, for folks who want to see some of the flagship on YouTube, they just had some 4-hour tops of 2022 2-part 8-hour epics. So you can definitely get your award season fix at InSessionFilm.com. But Zita, when we talked about Humphrey Bogart, I believe you said he was second to Robert Mitchum in your classic men pantheon.
No. Bogart is not really up there for me. That's what I was saying. In the echelon of great movie stars, Bogart isn't necessarily in the first tier for me. I can acknowledge his significance, but personally, let's say I was doing a ranking of my top 25, he probably wouldn't make it. Whereas Robert Mitchum, I just adore him. He's one of those immediately ingratiating screen personalities. He's such a singular presence. I don't think you can point to any other star from this period who has the same vibe as he does, and he's legitimately able to project this air of danger on screen in a way that a lot of other stars from this period don't. And you watch something like The Night of the Hunter, and it's sort of shocking that in 2 years' time, he went from playing this terrifying con man who murders a woman and then tries to kill her children and possibly an old lady, to being a romantic lead in Heaven Knows Mr. Edison. The range is unmatched, and his versatility is so fascinating to me, because even in the films where he's meant to be a romantic lead or the film is lighter in tone, he still has that edge. And I do think that it gives a lot of those movies an interesting quality. They're a lot darker than you expect them to be in many cases. And he's also just so darn reliable. I feel as though there are a couple of stars who are great and are undeniably charismatic in their best films. And you watch them and you think, wow, this is the greatest actor ever. But then they end up working with a weaker script, and you start to realize, they have a couple of deficiencies here and there. I don't think I've ever had that experience with Mitchum. He's just so consistent, and in every film, he really shows up to play and seems completely invested in the role. And you have to respect that.
That's one way to put it. Robert Mitchum has a vibe. He gives off a specific vibe. Now, I do know our drama teacher and in-session film critic, Amy Thomason. I wonder what her opinion is on Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, because she wanted to do a whole topic just on John Huston pictures. I'm a fan of Deborah Carr. It's Deborah Carr, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and I believe Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, was that on your top 10 list for her at In-Session Film?
Yes, it was. I really enjoy her in that role. It's fun to see her play a sexy nun, a character type that we don't get nearly enough of.
Now, because you're going to be remiss with me, because I went back and looked back at my Marilyn Monroe list, and River of No Return was not on it. So I feel like it probably must have been like right at the cutoff, maybe my honorable mention, because it's funny. That's the film that, outside of The Night of the Hunter, we're going to jump around through all his career. That's generally one of the first few films that I tend to think of when I think of Robert Mitchum. Like, but you have to understand, like, no, it's cool. Like, who else, could handle, some crazy, river raft, out in the wild with Marilyn Monroe, in jeans, getting rough and tumble, but Robert Mitchum. And it's kind of funny because I feel like until he got that kind of bad boy, kind of tough image, maybe Hollywood didn't know what to do with him, because you say how he was always Mr. Reliable, made a lot of movies. I mean, in the 40s, there's like 4, 5, 6 films a year where he just pops up and all these little bit parts, all these kind of early, like it feels like he's stalled up, getting a lot going. And then you get the story of G.I. Joe, which is actually his lone Oscar nomination for supporting actor. And yet, that's one of those, it's fine. It's a nice movie, but it's not a movie that you think of when you think of Robert Mitchum.
And I think that's one of the really notable things about his career. After that breakout, he is immediately sort of set off on the right path. And only a couple of years later, he makes Out of the Past, which is arguably the greatest of all of the film noirs. It's just an incredible film, undeniably a masterpiece. His performance in it really holds the entire project together, and that's saying something because it's a Jacques Tourneur movie, so it looks gorgeous. It has this great atmospheric quality, and it completely pulls you in from the first moment. And I don't know whether you can say that about a lot of other stars. I feel as though some people take a little longer to find their niche. And he really figured out what his vibe was relatively early on. And you do get this progression in his career, which is, again, fascinating to me. I think one of the fun aspects of discussing the careers of actors who had that sort of longevity is seeing how their screen persona changes over time and how it was molded by trends of the period. And you could say that he had to alter his persona less than, say, Joan Crawford, where you get these very dramatic shifts between decades. But you still notice that by the late 50s, audiences seem to have become more comfortable with the whole bad boy thing. And you even get something like Cape Fear in the early 60s, where his character is meant to be this embodiment of evil. And you really do see this embrace of the idea that these charismatic anti-heroes that he portrays are figures of fun, instead of being the sort of characters that get Protestants to protest against them. He was really widely loved in a way that a lot of other actors who played controversial roles, you could say, they didn't get that sort of widespread acceptance from the public.
I think the general public maybe would only give off at first hand maybe a couple, The Night of the Hunter, Cape Fear, when they think of Robert Mitchum. But I mean, he worked steady through his entire career. I mean, from the 40s up until, I remember seeing him in like the 80s, where he would pop up in like all the big like miniseries epics. Like he's got like a couple episodes in North and South and like War and Remembrance and things like that. And by that point, it was just who's the classy kind of old actor who's going to bring along like some nice gravitas, for just a little accent. And then I went back and saw things like Night of the Hunter and was like, oh, whoa, okay. Okay. Because, then I think of things like El Dorado where, and I feel like I'll devil's advocate with you, how some people think that it's one of those, is he always just playing Robert Mitchum? Is he always very kind of lazy or kind of casual, but I never get that feeling. But you love that tough guy vibe.
Sort of. It's not necessarily that. I guess that could be the stereotype, but there are a lot of other matinee idols from that period who sort of took on the mantle of the tough guy. John Wayne, for example, who really don't do it for me, just strike me as dull and don't generally interest me. I think the thing with Mitchum is that he's just so much more dynamic than a lot of those other actors. And I also think perhaps as a female viewer, there's a certain interest in the fact that he's sort of hyper-masculine on one hand, and yet he does appear in a lot of movies that are targeted towards female audiences. You think of something like Home from the Hill, which is this Vincent Minnelli melodrama. It's very florid. It's very overwrought in many respects. And clearly it was sort of aimed at younger women at the time of its release. And I think there's something admirable about the fact that he was willing to alter aspects of his persona in order to fit into that sort of project, instead of saying, no, I'm only making Westerns or action movies. And I do think that it really says something that he did appeal to both genders in a way that some of those other tough guys didn't. Because maybe I'm stereotyping here, but I do believe that John Wayne, throughout his career, was more popular with men than with women.
Well, then that's why El Dorado is an interesting crossroads to examine, because it's effectively a remake of Rio Bravo. It's got like instead of Rick Nelson being Montana, it's got James Caan being Colorado or something. So Robert Mitchum is playing like the drunken Dean Martin role. So yes, we have the person who is usually the so macho, so big guy, and yet he's being like, sympathetic, like they're kicking the spittoon in his face kind of thing. And he can have these moments of sympathy or for all his gruff, like, no, he can be an old softie. You know what I mean? But you don't like El Dorado?
I have never seen it.
Really?
So this is confession time, even as a big Robert Mitchum fan. I believe it's a relatively long Western. I assume that's what kept me away from it. Maybe that was one night where I thought, oh, maybe I'll throw on El Dorado. And then I looked it up and I saw that it was 2 hours and 20 minutes long. And I thought, maybe I'll watch something else. But I'm sure I'll get around to it one day. And I know it's one of his most highly regarded films. Obviously, it's one of the many movies that Howard Hawks made that is essentially a remake of his Rio Bravo. And maybe the John Wayne vibes kept me away from it, because while I have seen a lot of his films, it's pretty clear by now, I'm not the biggest fan.
And that's later. That's 67. And we could have another special. We have lots of topics, folks, that we could always talk about. We could do a whole saga on Howard Hawks. But because, you love like earlier stuff, 30s. I mean, is there any other standouts in the 40s? I mean, I feel like his work in the 40s, I mean, if I'm scrolling through the filmography now, that's more than some people today make in their lifetimes that he made in the 40s. Do you have any other early favorites?
No, I know that's the incredible thing about a lot of the actors working during this period. You just think, God, they were really working them to the bone. And one of those things that we discuss, versatility, a common knock against actors from this period, and you brought it up earlier, is that, they just play the same role in every film and they have this very well-defined persona and they rarely move out of their comfort zone. And I would generally push back against that in saying, well, yes, there are a couple of ticks that they usually bring to each part. And yes, they have this very recognizable persona. But if you look closely, you do notice the complexity that can be found in many of these performances. And in working on so many films every year, you do get more range, I would argue, compared to movie stars now, where we comment on it when someone stars in 3 films a year. And that was the norm back then. In fact, you were probably working less than your contemporaries if you were only starring in 4 movies in 1 year. And you get situations where he starred in Undercurrent, one of the only film noirs that Katharine Hepburn appeared in. And he's working with these directors who work in genre films, and those were generally seen as sort of lesser productions at the time, and people would kind of look down their noses at these movies and see them as this programmer junk that people went to on a Friday night and didn't really think about. Again, they weren't meant to make a big impact on audiences. And you get these films like Crossfire, which became an unexpected hit at the time of its release, was meant to be this B movie, ends up becoming a Best Picture nominee. I would argue that the film has certain shortcomings in terms of its script, but he's very impressive in the leading role. It's the sort of stoic turn that we don't really see anymore from male actors. And he really has to cede the stage to other performers at various points in this film, because they are asked to give these very flashy performances. And in some cases, they only have 1 or 2 scenes to make an impact. And I think it really says something that his character has to be so emotionally recessive and quiet, and essentially serves as a conduit for the audience. And yet you are still captivated by him.
Was that just too similar to Gentleman's Agreement that year?
Well, that's the odd thing. I would argue that they're actually very different films, even though they both deal with the issue of anti-Semitism. And the difficult thing with Crossfire is that the play that it's based on is about the subject of homosexuality. And it's about someone who was murdered for being gay by one of their homophobic colleagues. And then, of course, the studio got their hands on it, and as a bunch of homophobes decided, well, no, we can't put that on the screen. And so you end up with a movie that's kind of about anti-Semitism, but you can definitely tell that they had to rejig this script at the last minute to shift the focus away from the initial subject of the entire play. Having said that, it's a very solid film noir, and Gloria Graham is so much fun in the role of this femme fatale who is fed up and bitchy and tired of being put upon. And in some ways, it sort of plays like a parody of that character type, but she really looks to be enjoying herself. She's chewing the scenery, and I think it's a nice preview of what was to come for her with things like The Big Heat and later roles in Nicholas Ray pictures.
I wonder if this is a good example of just the Hollywood studio system at work, because you're the femme fatale for this studio, you're the ingenue for this studio. And it's funny just thinking visually, like you like the film noirs, and I picture Robert Mitchum and the tilted fedora of the film noir, but it's almost like he's kind of hiding something under his cap, like he wasn't necessarily meant for those roles in a way, because I feel like in the 50s, maybe it's even when he gets into color movies, it's very like today, men's pants, we went through that era where men's pants were down around their knees, but in the 50s, men's pants come up pretty high at the waist, but yet, there's so many of these Robert Mitchum roles where it's like, he's got the hat off and the jacket off and his sleeves are rolled up, or his tie is kind of loosened up, where it is almost like this, the macho, but it was too threatening on screen in the 50s or something. Maybe again, that's why I come back to, I enjoy River of No Return, because it's like, well, who else was gonna, tame Marilyn Monroe but Robert Mitchum kind of thing. But would you say that the 50s are his best decade?
Oh, well, it sort of depends. I would argue late 40s, early 50s. I don't think it's necessarily a decade in terms of his prime, but the 50s certainly served as a showcase for some of his best work. You obviously have The Night of the Hunter, which we've already talked about, but you also get Angel Face, which is a really sort of underrated noir. I guess you couldn't really call it underrated at this point. It's critically acclaimed and people talk about it all the time now, which is great to hear. And then you have The Lusty Men, a Western that I actually like, which is unusually sensitive for a picture from this period and is very sympathetic to the concerns of sort of aging men who feel as though they're losing the ability to succeed in their chosen occupation. And so that's sort of fascinating as an exploration of a midlife crisis. And it's also unusually frank about the struggles that certain married couples faced during this period. And at the same time, you notice that he still works prolifically during this period. He appears in multiple films every year. And in terms of River of No Return, that's really a strange bird of a film, because you can definitely sense, or at least I felt, that Marilyn Monroe is sort of tacked on to the movie in a way. And I don't blame her for this. I just don't think the screenwriters ever fully succeed in making it feel as though her character is an organic aspect of the plot, because it's sort of an American remake of Bicycle Thieves. And in that film, the central relationship is between a financially struggling worker and his young son, who's sort of learning about the ways of the world while watching his father get screwed over by a capitalist system. And you have a lot of that here. And then we'll cut to a Marilyn Monroe scene where she's singing and dancing in a glamorous outfit. And I would usually really enjoy that and think that's great fun. But this is not Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And it's sort of odd how the movie just forgets about her for 20 minutes at a time, and then we return to her every now and then. It's a very unusual picture in that regard, and it's definitely the sort of thing that you get out of old Hollywood a lot, where you have this massive star and they haven't figured out how to craft vehicles around them, and so they just get thrown into this random project that has already been in development for several months, and you can tell that they've been retrofitted in there.
Well, that's a Fox movie, and she was contracted to Fox, so it was like, oh, okay, now it's time for Marilyn Monroe to have her turn being in, some kind of, fun kind of wild action movie. But Robert Mitchum spent a lot of time with RKO, but I feel like he did a lot of other things for a lot of other studios. And like you said, to me, I feel like that was to his credit, to his benefit, because he was able to jump around in topics from noir to Westerns. And so he was never quite pigeonholed. And I don't know if that's because whoever held his contract knew what to do with him, saying what an asset, we can loan him out to these studios for these varied projects, and then when he comes back to our piece it'll be good, or I feel like they didn't know what to do with him and said, yeah, okay, whatever you want him, you go make it. But I don't know.
I think you also have to consider the fact that RKO was taken over by Howard Hughes in the 50s, and he mismanaged it. And within a few years, he essentially ran the business into the ground. And so it was a time of great instability at that studio. And so the RKO productions that Robert Mitchum did appear in all had behind-the-scenes problems and clashes between producers and directors. And then you can understand why he got loaned out so often, because I assume they wanted the money that would come in as a result of loaning out one of their biggest stars.
Yes, because how much of that was, of course, the pot arrest and his own tabloids and so scandalous and, we're making him even more of a bad boy that come see in the theaters and kind of silly things that kind of come along at the time. That was late 40s, like right before.
Yes. And I think it's interesting to consider, though, that scandal didn't really follow him around. Essentially, within 6 months, he was fine again, and his reputation had been completely restored, and audiences were just sort of okay with it, which you could say maybe it illustrates the odd morality at play in the late 40s, where someone essentially gets cancelled for having an affair or something, but a drug arrest is nothing. So it's sort of funny to think about. At the same time, I guess I'm glad that he overcame all of that. And then you also have the infamous incident when he went to the Cannes Film Festival in 1954, I believe it was, and posed with a woman who was topless and groped her in front of the cameras, and that caused a bit of a stir. So,
but that was okay because he's Robert Mitchum. The idea that he spent a night in jail for smoking pot, he's so cool. Compared to like Joan Bennett, who later said, she may as well have shot the man herself. Her husband shoots her agent, and she was like completely a pariah, tossed out of Hollywood for a while. So there certainly was, I guess, a double standard of, the backdoor tabloids and studio system kind of manipulations that were happening. But then it's so ironic when you get to the Night of the Hunter. We do have to talk about this a little more because that movie was like hated at the time. It didn't win anything. It didn't even do well. People didn't like it at all. They thought it was a terrible film. And you look at that now and you're like, how is that possible?
Yes, it's certainly a very unusual film, ahead of its time in many ways. And I guess people just weren't ready for it. At the same time, you do have certain reviews where they sound more mixed rather than being extremely negative. And you do have a lot of critics using descriptors like weird and intriguing to describe it. So clearly they recognized that there was something original there. I guess it just took a couple of years to catch up to it.
Because I would not say The Night of the Hunter is a horror movie.
No.
Me, of course, with my love of horror. But it's funny when you think of horror today, when people are surprised when they call it elevated horror or horror that has drama. Because to me, this is the perfect example of that. It's a drama film, but it has horrific elements in it, just which are generally personified in his character, and maybe, and I've said this before about Psycho, the idea of a, man's, house was his castle back then, kind of this kind of top dominance, the masculine of patriarchy of everything, that maybe people weren't ready to have that kind of violence close to home. But I mean, it's based on a book, obviously the real life cases, these things were happening at the time. And again, this maybe it was too close to home of like people not acknowledging what happens behind closed doors. A serial killer who's bouncing around from people, who's terrorizing kids. It was like that stuff obviously happened, and it was too much at the time. I don't know, because then you're right. He goes back to charm of Heaven Knows Mr. Allison.
I'm not entirely sure though, because he does make some very violent pictures during this period that do receive critical acclaim. Cape Fear was very well received, and in many ways that film is blunter in its treatment of things like child abuse. Perhaps it was just the manner in which it was presented, the sort of abstractions on display. Another descriptor used to describe it at the time was pretentious. And there does seem to have been sort of a rejection of the notion that this was an art film, and people weren't a big fan of some of the inventions that Charles Laughton introduced into the film. And the 50s are just such an odd period in terms of the social changes that were going on, and the fact that they're so buttoned up and conservative in many regards. And then you stumble on a film like Baby Doll, for example, which, even though it doesn't feature graphic nudity or anything, is far more sexually frank than the vast majority of films that I would argue we get today. And that is a bizarre Gothic melodrama. And you think this does not feel like anything else from this period. And so you do have this sort of material being smuggled into a lot of these movies.
Oh, for sure. 1955 in America to 1962 in America. Very different times.
Well, I'm not sure. Wasn't it sort of later on in the 60s, though? Because I feel as though early 60s, there's still a little bit, because it takes until 1968 for them to scrap the code altogether. And I still think of the early 60s as the sort of musical period where they're really leaning hard on biblical ethics in order to make money. And then you have more independent filmmakers who come along a bit later on, and people start taking drugs more openly. And that kind of changes everything.
It's a fascinating time. You know, I just saw some kind of headline or article saying, like, the way we refer to the good old days so nostalgically when people tend to talk about mid-century America, and then they fail to realize that it was not the good old days for lots of people, you know. And you said biblical epics. It's fascinating that, sure, 59 you get something like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, but then you're getting Psycho. So it's not necessarily the date line. I do think decades kind of carry over. Like if you said 40s Mitchum, I would maybe say like 44 to 54, 45 to 55 as the window. But as the 60s go on, I feel like things do get more turbulent. Of course, Kennedy and the Beatles kind of things happening. But I almost feel like Cape Fear is one of those films, a bold thing to say, that is one of those things that really kind of drive that change in cinema, because it's disturbing. I love Gregory Peck. You don't love Gregory Peck, but it is almost this representation of, here's the good wholesome man trying to defend his family, and then here's, you know, shirtless Robert Mitchum, which having his shirt off might have even been scandalous and shocking back then. But because I love the Sundowners too, which I feel like is kind of a much more nicer piece, not happy-go-lucky, but easier watch, I guess, than Cape Fear. I mean, you know, you're in for something when you watch Cape Fear.
Yes. The Sundowners, another odd film in that it earns a bunch of Academy Award nominations upon release. I believe it was a moderate hit, but it hasn't left much of a lasting impact. I don't think that people really talk about it anymore outside of discussing the Oscar race that year. And you have Deborah Kerr and Robert Mitchum, two beloved movie stars, in the leading roles. But it's definitely not their most notable work, you could say. At the same time, I quite like it, and I do think that it stands out for featuring a positive depiction of married life, which sounds like an odd thing to say, because you have this whole 50s ethos of you need to stay married and divorce is a sin and you should get married at 19 because that totally makes sense, and you shouldn't wait a little bit or date a couple of people before settling down. No, right after you graduate from high school, marry your neighbor. That makes sense. But this movie really stands out because their marriage just has a warmth to it in a way that I feel as though a lot of 50s movie marriages don't. There's still this sense of, oh, well, marriage is an obligation. It's not something that you actually enjoy. You don't like the person that you have to sleep next to every night. They're this annoyance that you have to endure in life. And it's sort of refreshing to see this movie about two people who've been married for a decade or so, who actually appear to enjoy each other's company.
I've been going through a Falconcrest rewatch, if we're talking about some of those 80s, like he did some of these miniseries and soap operas. And there's like it's amusing because the cast is, they're like 25 or 30-year-olds, but they're supposed to be playing like 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And yet, yeah, they're about getting married or something. And I'm like, wow, even in the early 80s, that was still like the very, of course, Reaganism, everything was supposed to be nice and perfect or something. But it's ironic because I'm not a fan of Deborah Carr, and I like the Sundowners. I don't really care for The Grass is Greener, but he worked with her quite a bit, didn't he? When you think about it.
Yes, they were very close friends. They got along famously, by all accounts.
I feel like he worked with her a lot. I feel like he worked with Gene Simmons in 2 or 3 films too.
Yes. I believe they were good friends. And of course, there's the famous story about them working on Angel Face together. And well, I guess this gets a bit dark. Gene Simmons at the time was being sexually harassed by Howard Hughes, and he allegedly encouraged the director of this film, Otto Preminger, to subject her to humiliation. And he reportedly told Robert Mitchum to slap her an exceptional amount of times during one scene, and they did a ridiculous amount of takes for this one scene, and he eventually turned around and hit Otto Preminger, which I would usually disapprove of. Don't abuse your boss. At the same time, read up on Otto Preminger. His behavior has been well documented, and I think he deserved just a little bit of pushback.
And, I have been a good girl since our last episode. I think I tweeted about this. I did watch a couple recent films. That was my New Year's resolution. We're talking about classics. I watched a horror film called She Will. It was very good with Alice Krieg, and Malcolm McDowell is playing a director, and she made like some great exceptional film when she was 13 years old. And now she's struggling with, being an aged starlet and having had a mastectomy, what is, look of woman. But then, of course, there's witchy retribution. And there's, a really great moment where Malcolm McDowell's on a talk show. And even the talk show host is saying, well, didn't you take it too far? And he's saying, well, we were making something great. And I wanted the best for her. I wanted to make her beautiful. And then you think of this sanctioned grooming. And we've mentioned this before of like, even if you remove anything salacious from it, to say the studios expressly groomed people, in old Hollywood. And we think we're new and shady with all these new scandals that come out. And we're like, no, this stuff has been going on for a long time, and I think of this in dark scope sometimes when I put this together. But then again, when I'm watching these soap operas and there's, a scandal every act, for the commercial break, and we think of soaps as being so, campy and over the top and ridiculous and preposterous. But then I think, well, now we just call that prestige TV. So the way these things kind of roll around again, for the way Robert Mitchum at times was vilified. Oh, the pot, the arrest, but then elevated for being macho and being a bad boy. We do the same thing today. Cancel people, a lot of people who should rightfully be canceled, probably. But then, we also elevate people. We're willing to look the other way for some of the bad things. So I feel like when people are educated by classic film, maybe they see these things more, but because ironically, I will say that the Cape Fear remake is one of the few films that you could say is just as good as the original Cape Fear.
Yes. No, it's definitely food for thought. And I do think it's important to remain educated on these things. And there is definitely a frustrating subset of classic film fans who insist that, oh, no, nothing like that happened back in the day.
Everything was sunshine and rainbows. Yes.
Everything was very classy and respectable back then. And there definitely weren't directors who tried to take advantage of their employees. And no, let's not talk about racism. That wasn't a problem back then. And that can be frustrating. I somewhat understand the argument that we shouldn't be too caught up in bringing some of those issues up when analysing these old films. And sometimes it is possible to look past the fact that, say, there's sexist content in a movie to find a lot of the virtues that are present in that film and that can be divorced from that specific context. At the same time, to completely ignore it is just irresponsible and silly, and it's completely worth having those conversations.
It's funny because we had our classic list and we said, oh, okay, we should talk about John Huston. And I had a chuckle to myself. We'll get to talking about John Huston eventually. We have so many topics on our list. I chuckled to myself because I was like, oh, Hollywood nepotism, 3 generations worth. And it's so funny.
Problematic artists.
When it's so funny because when I was a kid, I loved Christopher Mitchum. I thought he was so beautiful. And when I came upon Big Jake, I was like, oh my God, Patrick Wayne is in this. Christopher Mitchum is in this. I love these men. They're so handsome. They're so beautiful. It's so funny. And I guess they both had kind of respectable, decent careers for their time. Their sons, they made a few hits, and I feel like they went into more behind the scenes kind of things. But, when I think back, I don't think of, Robert Mitchum's legacy being that his son, Christopher Mitchum, is an actor, that I think his granddaughter was married to Casper Van Dien. I'm not thinking about the nepotism, but it certainly definitely was there. I liked Christopher Mitchum. I can't help myself. Do you care for Christopher Mitchum, Zita?
I'm not that well versed in Christopher Mitchum's oeuvre, but I'm sure I could do a deep dive one of these days.
No, I could tell you exactly why you're not aware of him, because his biggest films were Big Jake and Rio Lobo, which were John Wayne produced movies.
No.
Like, hey, BFF John Wayne, can you put my kid in a couple of your movies? Yeah, sure. And John Wayne's like, well, okay, I'm just gonna have 2 sons in this movie because my son Patrick Wayne is already in the movie, so it all works. So it all works out. All works out. It's kind of funny because it's almost like this. I guess this was 70s. But then, as I said, Robert Mitchum pops up in a couple TV appearances in the 80s. And now I sit back and wonder why he didn't have a regular 80s TV show kind of appearance. Like Lana Turner comes walking in her fur coats and Falcon Crest. And I'm like, oh, goody. But it died in 97 because if we could dream retroactively now, I think he would be really great in some kind of prestige TV show today, being, the father, grandfather of somebody, just add in some gravitas to a show. But we can dream. Was there any other kind of role that you think he could have done that he didn't do?
Oh, well, I suppose I would have been interested in seeing him appear in more 70s paranoia thrillers. I feel as though he would have been a really great fit for that genre, in part because a lot of his work in 40s film noirs definitely informed the mood and the tone of those films. And so I think it would be a great callback in a way to feature him in a couple of those movies. And you look at some of his 70s work and there are definitely quite a few paycheck roles in there. And I just think it would have been great if he could have worked with Ellen J. Pekuda or William Friedkin, some of the major directors from that period.
That's interesting.
Robert Altman.
Because I think of something like Midway, and I feel like maybe the 70s, for as much as we say he was really pushing the envelope in what he was doing in the 50s, and not just in one specific thing, but bouncing around in different topics, different subjects, and then really pushing the envelope in the 60s and being some of the groundbreaking force in some of these in the era. But then I almost feel like in the 70s, he was almost like, I don't know, still acting like, no, it's not fair to say still acting like it was the 50s. We're still making the traditional type of pictures, like he was not willing to go with some of the weird things that were happening in the 70s. I don't know. But then, as I said, he comes back in the 80s as the respected classic, cameo kind of roles. So I guess it evens out.
Yes. And when we talk about ageism, we generally focus on women, and I think for good reason, because the cutoff point, especially at that time, was so low for the ladies, and men did get to keep working a lot longer. But I still think that for older male actors, I assume that something like Midway was probably the best script that landed on their desk at that time, because maybe it is a problem. A lot of those edgy dramas that we love from the 70s did feature younger actors, and you have to assume that they were calling up Al Pacino and Gene Hackman before they went to Henry Fonda or Robert Mitchum.
Mhm. Because he died in 97, but again, you're a man, you don't like that. I do. You think of, Gregory Peck working up into the 90s in things that were still big epic things that had nominations and acclaim. So, and you're right, again, the industry allows men to come back as that. He could come back and be a character kind of actor, as opposed to, like, I was surprised when I looked up stuff. I didn't know he sang songs and made music.
Yes, calypso music.
Yeah. Is there something you'd like to share, Zita? Do you have some Robert Mitchum albums at home?
No, I don't own any. I believe at one point we owned a Clint Eastwood album, a special collector's edition, just for the novelty of hearing him sing. And of course, that later sort of ceased to be a novelty item when he started working on Gran Torino and recording all sorts of songs for different soundtracks. So, but it is quite funny to think of it when these actors with very macho images decide to come out with these albums, especially working in musical genres that don't necessarily conform to that image.
Well, that's another thing with today. We hate when singers decide they want to be actors and when actors try and sing songs. But we forget, again, back then it was expected to be a variety, well-rounded, that you could sing and dance. And if you had a show that you were going to sing the song and there was going to be a record about it, and that was that. So this is why we return to classic actors, because I feel like they can back up their skill, their talent. Well, they'll try anything once, and yet it was still entertaining and still did it well. So it's funny that I come back to the 1945, the supporting actor nomination for Story of G.I. Joe is the only nomination Robert Mitchum ever had, which is kind of surprising, because you immediately want to think like, oh my God, how was he not the best actor of the year for Night of the Hunter? So, but then you look at 1955, which was Marty year, and you're like, really? I don't know. In comparison, I like Marty, but I don't think it was the best film. when you have something like The Night of the Hunter, they're kind of waiting in the wings. So, why did Oscar not love Robert Mitchum for being as prolific as he was? I mean, statistically, you would think, geez, he had to have been nominated for other things, right?
Yes, it's definitely sort of a surprise for me. And comparing him to someone like Henry Fonda, who also seems like an actor who was very Academy friendly, very highly regarded throughout his career, is a prolific performer, stars in so many Hollywood productions, but he was nominated twice. And yes, he did win, but it's still strange that Henry Fonda won for an 80s movie. It doesn't seem right that it wasn't the 40s or the 50s. No, he had to wait until 1981. But with Mitchum, perhaps you could say it reflects the Academy's taste at that point in time. And a lot of these major Mitchum films that we look back on weren't necessarily received as big productions in their day. And the Academy's tastes in the 50s definitely hewed more closely to the idea of the big Hollywood epic. And you have cases in which Charlton Heston wins an Academy Award for starring in Ben-Hur, which is the most commercially oriented movie that you could possibly think of. And I do wonder, would he do better in today's environment? And that's ridiculous to think about, because the entire fabric of Hollywood has changed and the movies would be completely different. But I do think it's more common nowadays to see people get nominated for movies that aren't, I wouldn't call them independent films, but lower budget mainstream features. And in the 50s, that wasn't really the case. And the big movie stars got nominated for the highest grossing films of the year. And the trends have completely changed. So I think that's probably what prevented him from getting nominated. At the same time, I have to assume that there were a couple of years in which he got close to getting a nomination.
It's interesting that he was, I don't want to say he was a character actor because he was a leading man, but he did so much variety. And it's like Hollywood just thought he was just like rough macho cog in the wheel, that, you know, we can make a bunch of Robert Mitchum movies. He's cool, he's rough and tumble, and they're entertaining, and people will love them and people will go to see them. But that's all they're meant to be. I feel like they weren't looking for him for the gravitas, for the skill then, as opposed to what kind of he got onto later, further into his career. And ironically, today, I think he would thrive either way, whether he was making like stuff like The Rock being like the biggest thing because they're just, you know, fun, entertaining movies, or if he was coming back to, you know, I'm going to be the serious actor in, you know, a latter day, you know, glory kind of role. You know, I think he'd be really fun and really popular. He probably would have a really wild Twitter handle. I'm sure. Like James Caan did. James Caan just be like, that's the tweet. Oh, good. That's the tweet.
To be fair, when I said that, I'm glad that he worked during that period of Hollywood history. And I really do like his output. I just think it says more about where the Academy was at that point in time, that he couldn't get nominated, but Greer Garson could get 5 consecutive nominations.
Oh. They were conservative. They had their favorites. And like you said, Henry Fonda, by the 80s is where we get all the makeup Oscars. That's where the honorary things come out. And, you know, Paul Newman, you know, and you're like, really? Okay. You know, and then you look back at these films then and think, wow, why didn't you recognize this then? What do you think he came close to being nominated, or what do you think he should have been nominated for, or if he should have won?
Well, obviously, I would have had him win for The Night of the Hunter. I think that would have been a deserved award. But looking through, I can imagine him getting close to a nomination for Crossfire. That was a Best Picture nominee. It gets other acting nominations. And I have to assume that he was at least in the mix that year. And then this is sort of an odd one to talk about, but Ryan's Daughter, which is this infamous failure, was critically savaged upon release, was the film that caused David Lean to go on hiatus for 14 years and really dealt a blow to his reputation at the time. And personally, I'm one of those people who thinks that he peaked with Brief Encounter, which is my favorite movie of all time. So that's not saying much. But I prefer the intimate, small-scale dramas that he was making in Britain in the 40s. And when he moved to America, well, he didn't move there, but he started working with American money, you could say, and making these massive epics. That's not my favorite phase of his career. And there are people who view Lawrence of Arabia and The Bridge on the River Kwai as some of the greatest films ever made. I just don't see it, and don't even get me started on Dr. Zhivago. But sorry, that was a big tangent. But having said that, I'm not one of those people who thinks that David Lean's epics represent the pinnacle of cinema. At the same time, I did watch Ryan's Daughter a lot growing up. So it's sort of a guilty pleasure. I can't fully pretend that I'm not nostalgic for it in many regards. And even though it was a massive failure, I think it made money, but critics hated it. It did earn quite a few Academy Award nominations, and John Mills won an Oscar for it. And I think he might have been in the running for a Best Actor nomination. And there are plenty of things to criticize about Ryan's Daughter. I think he's quite good in it.
Oh. David Lean is on our director's list of topics to discuss. So I'm sure
Okay.
Amy Thomason, well, that can be one of the debate episodes. So I'll just sit back and let you ladies go. It's funny when you say Ryan's Daughter, because like period piece, like World War One, like melodrama, British production, you look at that now kind of like, oh, that's automatically going, that is usually today what we would say is like Oscar bait kind of film. So it's ironic the way, again, styles and changes kind of come back again. You watch, that's your guilty pleasure.
Yes.
Do you have a real Robert Mitchum guilty pleasure?
Well, I would say that's the big one. And in terms of how tastes have changed, I think the big change is that a movie like Ryan's Daughter wouldn't get made today. I can't think of the last time that a big romantic epic won Best Picture. I feel like there was a bit of a revival of that trend in the 90s, and you had The English Patient and Titanic, but those movies have lost money for years. And I feel as though it's been ages since one of those films really hit big.
Maybe like 20, 25 years ago, because I think we've had this discussion on Twitter or off recordings, but like The King's Speech, how people don't like that. And then I look back at it as, yeah, it's a good movie, but it was the British period piece biopic type. Of course, it was going to get like award stuff. That's just the way kind of the awards kind of askew, but you're right. They have become like the prestige, like arty, unusual movies, and that don't make a lot of money. And even period pieces, I guess at this point, are just expensive. And now that's swung back to television. I watched some of the Dangerous Liaisons, a TV show that was on Stars, which first came out the gate, had a lot of ratings, and they said, oh, we're automatically renewing it for season 2. But then I guess as the episodes went on and there was trickle down, it became like, oh, we didn't have enough audience or advertising. It didn't do well enough for us to justify the production costs. So at this point, again, you come back to, doesn't matter if the story or the talent is there. It still comes down to industry, which our industry is in a hot mess right now. I suppose the irony of we're in free for all. Anybody can produce something, and sell it to any platform. But then also you have other things that are operating like a studio system. So who knows? Who knows? Do you have it's kind of funny because the late 90s, I guess, when a lot of these actors it was more of a changing of the guard. Robert Mitchum died, when Gregory Peck died, which again, I always feel like they were kind of antitheses to each other, good guy versus bad boy kind of thing. But that old guard kind of went away. And like you said, Pacino or De Niro and Dustin Hoffman really coming up in the 70s. But then these stars are kind of gone. I can't really think of anybody that's comparable to Robert Mitchum today. Can you?
I can't, no. And returning to an earlier point in our conversation, another thing that sets him apart, even from his contemporaries, is that in addition to being that tough guy, which was a very popular image at the time, he does have a lot of unexpected quirks. And I don't think that a lot of the other top movie stars from the period were releasing calypso music albums on the side, for example. And I think that does make him more intriguing to modern audiences than some of the film stars who were hugely popular at the time, but feel like relics from that part of history. And their appeal back then doesn't necessarily translate today.
Like Charlton Heston. I think about all the things that we've been through in America, unfortunately, in the past few years. And I think about if Charlton Heston were alive which side, where would he be? Would we have, Charlton Heston, who was marching in the civil rights movement, or would we have, crotchety old Charlton Heston, saying, you'll have to pry the rifle out of my cold dead hands? I think about that often. And again, to think of, well, can we separate the films, But that's the nature of when you watch classic movies. You almost want to justify it. Like I could say, well, I could probably shoehorn in some of my favorites now, who I would say are similar bad boys to Robert Mitchum, Sean Bean. I would think maybe, but I don't know. You're right. He did seem very interesting, and overall, I just think that the studios just did not know what to do with him at the time. But and by time the studio or realized what he was capable of doing, he was old. So do you have your top 3?
Oh, okay.
Can you narrow it down? Top 5?
Gosh, that's difficult because he's one of my favorite actors. But and this might be blasphemous, but I would probably have Home from the Hill in third, and then The Night of the Hunter, and in first place, Out of the Past.
I guess I'm more not layman, or I'd go more generic. I would probably say The Night of the Hunter at Cape Fear. Yeah, but then also, sometimes you think of something random like Thunder Road, back when you could watch movie classics or Turner Classic Movies, and it'd just be like, oh, a movie that's coming on that has Robert Mitchum in it. Oh, click. Oh, okay, Thunder Road. Whatever. It was still good. It was still entertaining.
Yes.
Out of the Past. But those are your top 3. If you were introducing someone to Robert Mitchum, would you choose different films?
No, I think those are good introductory texts, you could say. And then maybe if you were going further on and you wanted to show them that, he has range, he was capable of stepping outside of his comfort zone, you might show them something like What a Way to Go, the very campy Shirley MacLaine comedy where she marries Paul Newman, Robert Mitchum, Dean Martin, and Gene Kelly. What a lineup of men. Oh, and Dick Van Dyke and Robert Cummings are along for the ride too.
That was mid-60s, and it's camp romp.
It's wonderful.
I feel like it's glitzy, fun, wild. But then you think of how all these men became like the star-studded lineup of these 70s disaster pictures, and you're like, no, why couldn't we just have had more movies like that were like this, where it's like, ooh, one chick's just picking up all these classic dudes. Like, yes, please. How do you feel about The Longest Day?
Oh,
that's
one of those.
Everybody and their grandmother shows up in that movie.
Right, yes. Not a film that managed to hold my interest, I would say. And it doesn't help that the presence of all of those big names is sort of distracting, especially because none of them are really given anything to do. And that makes sense. It is a war movie. And while I understand that you are acting when you're performing a battle scene, for example, a lot of that film consists of wide shots of throngs of people fighting one another. And so Robert Mitchum is just sort of there to introduce star power and gravitas into the mix. And you always end up asking these questions while watching a war movie. But is it possible to film warfare or to depict the experiences of a soldier without aestheticizing it? And even if you're trying to make an anti-war movie, or you're trying to make a humanistic masterpiece that is about the toll that war has on these men, it might not be possible, because even when you're filming it, you're still trying to make it look cool to the audience, and you're still trying to make them engaged in this thing. And so does it end up becoming entertaining? And then do you end up putting across the wrong message? And little boys walk out of the theatre thinking, oh, warfare, it's so great. I want to sign up when I turn 18. And in the case of The Longest Day, it's a bit less complex because it's not really an anti-war film. It's very much a propaganda picture in a way. And so you could say that those moral concerns don't come into play. At the same time, and another big problem I have with war movies is that one of the reasons that they're uninvolving is because it's very difficult to identify with someone when they spend most of the film in sort of heavy duty clothing. And so you can barely see anything except for their face. They're not allowed to display that much physicality. And you don't get to learn that much about their life. And so it can be sort of difficult to connect to that character and to feel any emotional connection. And then on top of that, warfare itself beats a person down and it can emotionally numb them. And so as a viewer, I just find it very easy to get bored during these movies. And then I feel terrible about that because I think, oh God, Zita, are you not registering how horrifying this is?
But again, is that an American thing? We have to be so rah, rah, rah. I mean, I'm surprised that The Longest Day got a lot of technical nominations and wins, because my first reaction is it's long. It should be edited differently. There are some parts that almost look like they did filming separate things. Like here was where we did a big battle scene, and then, oh no, now it's time for John Wayne to walk in and say his piece. Like it seems like it was shot separately, so like. But yet somehow up until Saving Private Ryan, it was like, oh my God, The Longest Day, that's the D-Day movie. And it's like, well, yes, it is the D-Day movie, but that doesn't mean that it was, the perfect film. And again, came around an odd time. That was early 60s, when you feel like if they were going to make war movies like the way they did make war movies during World War II, that were basically like, let's go be heroes. Yay. Have a good time. And then they did make, films right out of the post-war, it feels like it was a film that came too late, even though part of you is kind of like, maybe I understand why there was such a long delay. I still don't want to see, movies that, when I see some of these movies that say during lockdown and COVID, I'm like, no, too soon. Too soon. I still only go out of my house a couple times a month. Too soon, so another thing that maybe came around at the wrong time. I don't know.
You could say, and I think you get a lot of this again with war movies. It's a fascinating historical document because it's made before the US really gets involved in the Vietnam War. And I do think that completely changes the way that war movies are received. Even films about World War II, which is generally considered to be sort of a safe subject. Everyone was on the same side during that war, at least in America, and we can all celebrate rah patriotism. We did the right thing. The pall of the Vietnam War hung over any war movie released during that period. Whereas 1962, it's sort of different. People are still caught up in that patriotic fervor, but it does begin to feel more distant. And so I guess you could say that makes it fascinating, but the experience of actually watching the film isn't all that enjoyable.
But now Robert Mitchum was not in the service. I mean, he was making, all these assembly line movies during World War II.
Yes, he's like Gregory Peck.
Yeah, with John Wayne, another one of those was in so many movies, but no, actually never served in the war.
I think John Wayne is different in that he went on to tell young men off for not wanting to enlist in the Vietnam War. And you think, well, that's a bit rich, John, because you did not volunteer when you had the opportunity to.
Oh, my Lord. Well, what the heck is the name of the goofy movie that he made about Vietnam? The Green Berets. Thank you. Oh, my God. Completely preposterous. Not going to forget that. My father was a Green Beret. But, again, very different times. I mean, you had to say World War II, you would have to say, is the war that had to be fought. And when I was little, all the older men who were in World War II They never talked about it, but it was like, respect them, as opposed to, yes, my father's a Vietnam veteran. And in the 80s, it was very, well, don't talk about that. Don't mention that to people. He'd be like, oh, you said that on a podcast? What? It was a very different time. And again, like I think I've said before, think like television actually, with like things like Magnum PI or Quantum Leap were the things that really began to push. We need to talk about Vietnam. Come out. You get something huge like Platoon. Like those were they took a while for that, as opposed to, yes, World War II heroism happening while it's happening. Compared to, we need a decade or so to talk about Vietnam.
I guess it's about, you do have the Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now back to back in the late 70s. Those are both huge movies in terms of the impact, but the packaging of these war movies was definitely very different in that these Vietnam films sort of aimed to be controversial and polarizing, whereas World War II movies are meant to be fun for the whole family in a weird way. And, oh, you can take your grandmother to this and she can have rosy memories of her childhood. And it's a very odd experience in a way, the way that we've sentimentalized what is ultimately a tragedy, because so many people were lost fighting that war.
Well, we come back to the story of G.I. Joe, which you ended up having, G.I. Joe dolls and G.I. Joe little action figures and a G.I. Joe cartoon, where, the bad guy always gets to live another day, Cobra Commander. And, everybody always parachutes out at the last minute. Nobody ever dies because it's safe for kids, and learning is half the battle. There was, again, I guess the 80s were a very different time. Shall we say, when by the time you get to the G.I. Joe cartoon. So who knows? But I don't suppose you would like to think, if Robert Mitchum were alive today, where he would stand politically.
Yes, that's an odd case. Do you think about that with so many Hollywood actors from that period? And I guess the thing that I think is, well, if they were alive today, they would have had to have been born much later. And you think, well, if they're growing up in a completely different environment, you have to assume that their views would be different. And I was pleasantly surprised. It always worries me when elderly celebrities that I like start talking about politics, but I'm a fan of the Everly brothers. And I think Phil Everly, before he very sadly passed away, revealed that he was not a Trump supporter, and he threw his endorsement behind Hillary Clinton. So I was very glad about that. I remember seeing a headline, he speaks out about Trump, and I was very concerned, oh God, is he a Trump supporter? But no, thank goodness he's not.
Yeah, Meatloaf died. It was like, oh my God, I love Meatloaf. And then it was like, oh, no, wait, this is what he was doing recently. Oh, okay. Or even James Caan. I mean, part of me was kind of like, oh, wow, I didn't know he was that hardcore. And that, does taint it. I wish we lived in uninteresting times, unfortunately. But unfortunately, we don't. But that's why we can enjoy going back to these movies, which is fascinating. I think about how something like The Night of the Hunter today, I don't think if it was made today would be as good. I think it would be really over the top in what I perceive as the subtext of the movie. I mean, how much what he is doing to terrorize these kids. I think today it would be outright stated. It would be really elongated torture porn, montage, flashback. And I think it would be completely disturbing and uncomfortable and inappropriate to watch and unnecessary and not under the excuse that, well, it's art, it's okay. So, I'm glad to look back at classic films. We have so many classic topics to discuss. We have a big list. What are you looking forward to classic wise? Because we asked for your film resolutions for 2023. You wanted to watch more new animated movies, but what are your classic film resolutions?
Oh, well, in terms of what's coming up on the podcast, I'm looking forward to talking about John Huston with Amy, and there are quite a few of his late period films that I have not seen. So I'm definitely going to try to seek out the life and times of Judge Roy Bean and Wise Blood and a lot of those acclaimed 70s films that I just never got around to.
I need to add Paul Newman to the list. Is Paul Newman on the list? We can talk about Paul Newman. What are you talking about on the 300 Passions podcast recently?
Oh, so recently I talked about a John Huston film, Pritzi's Honor. Unfortunately, not one that I'm a fan of. One of those bizarre films where it feels as though everyone working on it was sort of asleep at the wheel, even though they're all very talented individuals. But it was a lot of fun to talk about that with Valentina Starkovich, who is a good friend of mine.
Okay, that's funny because in John Huston's case, I feel like I saw some of those older or later day things when I was younger, like the things that I saw first. Like I saw Robert Mitchum older first, which worked in his favor, as honestly, as opposed to Marlon Brando. I mean, when I was a kid seeing him in his later day Island of Dr. Moreau, and then supposed to go back and think like everybody's saying, oh no, but he looks so hot and sexy in his shirt and in his streetcar.
Oh, he was. He's so beautiful.
And I'm like, well, but I know what happened to him later. So again, that we have to ignore that the tainted distortion and just look at classics for classics. What is your final thoughts in the Robert Mitchum retrospective?
Oh, well, generally, he's just a wonderful actor, fully deserves to be one of the most well-regarded performers from this period. I'm so glad that people are keeping his legacy alive. And it's really nice to see that people still watch at least his most iconic films, because so many of these classic performers that we talk about have fallen into obscurity, and it can be difficult to track their films down. And you don't face that problem with Mitchum. And I hope that it stays that way.
Now, we are probably going to talk about more offbeat Oscar or award kind of topics as award season comes along, because we're just unusual like that. We have a lot of opinions with all of our ladies, but you can follow some of the current award things that are happening at InSessionFilm.com. And Zita, you haven't written about Robert Mitchum a lot, have you?
No, I haven't. I should probably.
We need top 10 Robert Mitchum now from Miss Zita Short. Oh,
yes.
You can read some of the classic film reviews that we have done at InSessionFilm.com, or follow at InSessionFilm on Twitter. And they are also actually InSessionFilm on Instagram as well. Every once in a while, I get an alert popped up from InSession on Instagram. So in case, because Twitter is crazy. Zita, your personal handle is Zita_short. And you're at 300 Passions Podcast, where you can hear all of your discourse there. I'm at There for a Review. I'm Kristin Battestella. I always forget to say myself because I just want to jump in and quiz you. And you can see more of the In Session podcasts and Chasing the Gold, Extra Film Awards, all that. Actually, there's some video of some podcasting on YouTube, and you can follow along on the Patreon as well if you'd like to support the flagship, because they do a lot of big fancy stuff. So we try. I asked you what you're doing next. I told you you have to write about Robert Mitchum now.
Yes.
Yes, Zita, thank you for being here, and thank you to those that are listening. You can follow our work at InSessionFilm.com, and we'll see you at the next Women in Session.